Well, everybody, it's Halloween again, that time of year when we celebrate all things creepy, kooky, strange, and spooky. But less famously, it's also All Hallows' Eve, a night when we're supposed to remember and pay tribute to the spirits of the departed. I figured this year, why not do both? So tonight we'll be discussing a horror-themed series that has sadly left us, courtesy of renowned slot machine manufacturer Konami. Tonight, let's talk about Castlevania. Specifically, the Metroidvania-style entries in the series, which began with Symphony of the Night in 1997 and ended with Order of Ecclesia in 2008. This mini-series consisted of 7 games spanning just over a decade of gaming history, and despite all following a similar design pattern, they're remarkably diverse in tone and setting. In one entry, you're a handsome, pale guy with white hair trying to rescue his girlfriend, and in another, you're a French schoolgirl beating up Dracula's minions with a magic book. And then in another entry, you're a handsome, pale guy with white hair. And then in another, you're the same guy, and okay, fine, so they're not always that different. But one critical thing that all the Metroidvanias have in common is a borderline insane devotion to enemy variety. It's actually hard to find a portable Castlevania that has fewer than 100 regular enemies, not to mention bosses. How could the developers possibly come up with so many ideas each game, you ask? That's the same technique that all great writers have used throughout history. Plagiarism. Tons of Castlevania enemies are inspired by the world's literature, everything from ancient Greek myth to 19th century Gothic novels to Russian folktales. Koji Igarashi and his team were clearly way into lore of all kinds, and practically every time you enter a room in one of these games you can see the results. So here, in no particular order, are my 13 favorite literary Castlevania enemies. You'll be shocked, you'll be stunned, you might even be tempted to crack open a book or two. So hang on to your library as we get started with Number 1. Everyone's heard of the Salem witch trials, the 17th century case of mass hysteria that may or may not have been caused by ergotism and partly inspired one of the least read books in high school English class history. It's generally acknowledged today that this witch hunt was just an overblown expression of Puritan paranoia that went too far. But what if it wasn't? One of my biggest reasons for liking this enemy is that it has a very simple, classic design. It's a young woman with white hair wearing a loose-fitting robe who floats in midair and attacks you with magical projectiles. I mean, regular witches in Castlevania do that too. But really, why settle for a plain old witch when you could have a Salem witch? The name this enemy has in later games is Aliarumnus, a really obscure term that refers to a race of witches that supposedly lived in ancient Gaul and were driven out by the Gothic king Philomer. Their name appears exactly once in a work by the 6th century Byzantine historian Jordanes about the history of the Gothic kingdom. Yeah, that's right. We're just getting started and we already have a major historical deep cut on our hands. It can only get stranger from here. Number 2. Shmoos are a fictional race of cute blobby creatures that first appeared in the classic comic strip Lil Abner. Shmoos are characterized as a kind of ideal domesticated animal pushed to the point of absurdity. They live on air and multiply like crazy, taste delicious and willingly cook themselves so people can eat them, give bottled milk and have pelts strong enough to make a house out of. Live shmoos are also so cute and lovable that everyone would rather watch them frolic around than go to the movies or watch TV. An idea that proved to be surprisingly prescient, since shmoo toys and merchandise turned out to be hugely popular through the 1930s. In the strip, shmoos are so useful and generous that they end up replacing every single product ever invented and essentially destroy the economy of the entire United States. This provokes the government into sending out units called, I swear I am not making this up, shmooicide squads to kill all the shmoos. Fortunately, the heroes are able to save 2 of them and send them away to safety. Compared with its namesake, Castlevania's shmoo isn't quite as interesting. It's just a floating, half-cute, half-creepy head that's seen in Symphony of the Night's most bizarre level, the Forbidden Library. This location's other major enemies, by the way, include a hopping scarecrow, a robotic tin man, and a lion-headed knight. What can I say? I love this silly game. Number 3. Durga is basically the coolest female character in all of Hindu mythology. She's the warrior form of the goddess Shakti, 8-armed and usually riding on a Bengal tiger while she lays the smackdown on various demons, or Rakshasas if you're a Hindu hipster. In art, she's often depicted battling the super-powerful buffalo demon Mahishasura. Even her name is cool. It literally means impassable, and refers to her status as an unstoppable killing machine. Aria of Sorrow did a decent job of translating her badassery to a 2D sprite, depicting Durga as a 4-armed, long-haired woman who dances back and forth with a sword in each hand. There's even a stronger version of her later in the game, who's based on an even creepier incarnation of Shakti, the infamous goddess and Indiana Jones antagonist, Kali. See? Wait a minute. Oh no. No, they didn't. Number 4. From ancient India, we move to ancient Rome. The catoblepas was a legendary creature described by Pliny the Elder, famous naturalist and Pompeii dustbiter, as an ox-like animal whose head was so heavy that it constantly faced down, which was a good thing, because if it did manage to look up at you, its gaze could kill you instantly. This monster is a classic Castlevania enemy, showing up in most of the portable games. It always appears as an enormous beast with petrifying breath, possibly a reference to Pliny's claim that the catoblepas's breath could cause vegetation to wilt. It's nice to have a game petrify you with something other than the cliché Gorgon gaze, and doing it through an enemy with a weird Latin-y name makes it all the better. Number 5. When you consider that Castlevania is made by a Japanese company, it's surprising that very few of its enemy creatures are based on Japanese mythology. Maybe it's because so many Japanese mythological creatures are kind of silly. This one certainly is. The Tsuchinoko is a reclusive snake-like creature with a fat little body and venomous fangs. It's popularly supposed to be able to speak and to be attracted to alcohol, but there aren't many stories about it because even people who believe in it say it's very hard to find. Appropriately, in Aria of Sorrow, the Tsuchinoko is such a rare enemy that you might play through the whole game without ever knowing it exists at all. It only appears 20% of the time in one room, which happens to be a place you only need to visit one time over the course of the entire game. If you do see it, the Tsuchinoko immediately burrows into the ground to get away from you. Getting its soul is pretty difficult. I spent upwards of half an hour on it, but it's worth it for the novelty alone. Its soul ability is called VIP and lowers the prices at in-game shops. One last thing about the Tsuchinoko. In some myths, it's suggested that it has the power to jump into the air, then jump again while still in midair. You heard that right. It's the only mythological creature in history to have a double jump. You can't be a fan of Metroidvanias and not appreciate that. Number 6. In Greek myth, Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Most mythology buffs will remember her because of the story where Hades kidnapped her and tricked her into eating a pomegranate seed, which meant that even after she was rescued, she had to go back to the underworld for 3 months every year, and that's why winter exists. On the Greek myth believability scale, I would rate this one somewhere below nymph turns into a tree to avoid being molested by Apollo, and above guy kills his own son and tries to trick Zeus into eating him. Anyway, Castlevania's interpretation of Persephone is a little different, presenting her as Dracula's maid, or rather one of hundreds of identically dressed Dracula maids. In Portrait of Ruin, they even have little skull-shaped vacuum cleaners that they tote around. Now that's a neat little detail. But the best part is that when you get close enough to her, Persephone stops curtsying and starts laying the smackdown on you with karate chops and roundhouse kicks to the face. It's good to know Dracula has such high standards for his service staff. Impeccable manners, flawless dusting technique, must have 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Number 7. One of the quirkier episodes in Dante's Inferno occurs when Virgil and Dante enter the 8th circle of hell, Malabranche, home to fraudsters of every variety. At one point, Dante sees a group of blackmailers and extortionists being thrown into a river of molten pitch, and when they try to get out, a bunch of demons with grappling hooks tear them to shreds. But these are no ordinary demons. This fun-loving bunch is called the Malabranche, literally wicked claws, and every one of them has his own totally awesome nickname. Castlevania isn't the only series to have reused these names. Several bosses from Final Fantasy IV had them, for example, but it's probably the most comprehensive, with 6 of the 13 appearing in Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow. Aria had Cagnazzo, Scarmiglione, and Rubicante, while Dawn featured Malicota, Barbariccia, and Dragonazzo. And if you think those names kick major ass, just wait till you hear them in English. Nasty Dog, Troublemaker, Redface, Wicked Tail, Curly Beard, and Big Nasty Dragon. I know what you're thinking. Why, Cinnamon, those would all be amazing names for a rapper, a monster truck, or a brand of private label hot sauce. And you would be absolutely right. That's the magic of the Malabranche for you. Number 8. At first glance, these two enemies wouldn't seem to have much in common except that they're both plants. But in fact, they're actually the same plant, a mandrake. Alraune is just the German translation of the Greek Mandragora. The mandrake itself is a totally real member of the nightshade family, which also contains some of the deadliest plants found in the vegetable kingdom. Mandrake can seriously mess you up. It causes blurred vision, dizziness, and hallucinations, which may explain why so many bizarre myths have cropped up about this plant during the course of botanical history. To start with, medieval herbalists claimed that the root of the mandrake was shaped like a man. Nope, not seeing it. Maybe I need to eat a few more of these. Anyway, the mandrake was supposedly a super effective charm against bad luck and curses, but if you tried to dig one out of the ground, it would give off a horrible scream that would kill anyone who heard it. Mandragoras in Castlevania do just that, popping out of the soil when you approach and screeching loud enough to lop off a big chunk of your health bar if you're not careful. The Alraune refers to another folkloric aspect of mandrakes, the idea that they can be used to make love potions. This is a really old superstition. I'm talking appearing in the original Greek translation of the Bible old. Castlevania's Alraune, which appears as a beautiful girl wrapped up inside a huge flower, might also take some cues from the totally outrageous German novel of the same name, first published in 1911. I won't go into the book's plot here because it is 100% NSFYT, but let's just say it reads like a gender-swapped version of Frankenstein written by Sigmund Freud and Oscar Wilde during an all-night coke bender. Which is totally something that could have happened, by the way. Number 9. No, this is not, in fact, the patron saint of tickles, or octagons, or whatever else you may have been imagining. Saint Elmo, non-silly name Saint Erasmus, was a 3rd century Christian martyr who ultimately became the patron saint of sailors, possibly because of an apocryphal story in which he preached during a thunderstorm even after a bolt of lightning struck the ground right next to him. In keeping with the electricity theme, St. Elmo's fire is an eerie visual phenomenon seen hovering around pointy objects, like ship spars, in the presence of a strong electrical field, like during a thunderstorm at sea, for example. It also happens to be the name of a really boring 80s movie, which is basically like a grown-up version of The Breakfast Club if everyone in The Breakfast Club was a complete asshole. But that's beside the point. St. Elmo happens to be one of the odder enemies in Order of Ecclesia, a ghostly green monster that appears underwater to bother you while you deal with more substantial enemies. The Elmos will move up to you, then moan pathetically as they stretch their bodies across the screen to damage you. There's something really disturbing about how lackadaisical these enemies act as they stretch and phase out of existence, like some kind of demented aquatic bandersnatch. And when a Metroidvania enemy gets an obscure Lewis Carroll reference out of me, you just know it's a class act all around. Number 10. Of the many obscure literary sources that Castlevania's enemy designers have tapped for inspiration, one of the most fruitful has been the anonymous 17th century grimoire known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. Its first chapter, called the Ars Getia, or Art of Demon Summoning, lists 72 demons, along with their supposed powers, and how to summon them for fun and profit. More than half a dozen of these guys have ended up in the Castlevania series, and one of my personal favorites is Andrus. Andrus is described as a Grand Marquis of Hell who controls 30 legions of demons. He has an angel's body and the head of an owl, wields a sword, and rides a huge black wolf. Luckily for us, we don't have to imagine what that would look like, because in 1818, some French guy named Jacques-Auguste Simon Colin de Plancy put out a dictionary of the Lesser Key demons, complete with illustrations by Louis Le Breton. Let's look at the picture for Andrus right now. Wow. That's just embarrassing. First of all, that is definitely not a wolf. That's a dog. Kinda looks like a German pinscher to me, not that I'm a dog expert or anything. Second, the way he's holding his sword not only looks extremely uncomfortable, but combined with the lack of perspective, it basically looks like he just finished ramming it through his own jugular vein and out the other end of his neck. And finally, I don't know how he did it, but old Louis somehow managed to draw one of the goofiest owl heads I've ever seen. It's also tilted at a weird angle, and doesn't seem to connect to his body properly, which really doesn't help the whole self-decapitation thing at all. This dictionary, by the way, also gave us such wonderful conversation starters as this, and of course, this, all of which are also Castlevania enemies. But he drew this too, which is actually pretty unnerving, so It just occurred to me that I haven't really said anything about Castlevania's take on Andrus, probably because there's not much to say. It's a big crow-headed guy on top of a wolf. He does drop a motorcycle jacket, though, which you have to admit is pretty metal. Anyway, moving on. Number 11. This enemy is kind of the opposite of the last one. Really interesting as a Castlevania enemy, not so much in the source she originally comes from. Laura is named after the protagonist of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel Carmilla. In the book, Carmilla is a young girl who's sent by her mother, who never actually appears in the story, to live with Laura and her father in their castle in the middle of the woods. Carmilla becomes good friends with Laura, despite a few little eccentricities like sleeping through most of the day, exploding with anger whenever she hears people singing hymns, and, trying to seduce Laura several times. Laura starts to have dreams about being bitten by some strange creature in the night. A blue spot is discovered on her neck, and in a turn of events that will shock absolutely no one, it turns out Carmilla's a vampire. A vampire, by the way, who also goes by the pseudonyms Milarca and Mircalla at various points in the story. So in case you thought the Dracula franchise was the first to use that stupid plot point, it actually wasn't. Unlike the rather milquetoast Laura from the novel, Castlevania's Laura is pretty intimidating. At first she just walks toward you wearing a slinky dress, and she seems totally harmless. If you do any damage to her, though, she flips out, literally, and starts to jump all over the room spin-kicking like a wire fu protagonist on meth. The combination of speed, attack power, and evasive ability makes her a pretty tough enemy, in a game that frankly doesn't have a lot of them. She also just has a really fun design in general. I love how she switches in an instant from evening dress Barbie to some kind of leotard-wearing judo gymnast. Even her hair changes color. There are plenty of creepy Castlevania enemies, but not nearly enough who have a touch of humor and lightheartedness like this one. Number 12. If you've read any amount of Greek mythology, you probably know that the ancient Greeks were willing to let their heroes get away with a lot of, shall we say, questionable behavior. But one thing that was a definite no-no was hubris, basically becoming so arrogant that you thought even the gods and their rules were beneath you. So if you did something really stupidly self-absorbed, the gods would make sure you got what was coming to you. In fact, the goddess responsible for this punishment was literally named the one who gives what is due, which in Greek was Nemesis. Her male counterpart, Alister, was a spirit who avenged evil deeds, especially murder. These two deities appear all over Greek literature, both literally and as a metaphor for the retribution that eventually catches up with wrongdoers. Fittingly, the Castlevania enemies named after them share a lot in common as well. Both are shadowy figures whose only physical presence is a sword that floats in midair. Nemesis is blue and wields a dueling rapier that she stabs at you in a flurry of strokes. Alister is red and wields a huge broken-off longsword that sweeps across the screen, acting more like a bludgeon than a blade. Of the two, I find Alister more interesting, if only for what happens when you defeat him. Once the last blow is struck, the ghostly red figure starts to evaporate, while the sword falls to the ground below and shatters. Is this some kind of metaphor for how feelings of revenge ultimately lead to self-destruction, slowly eroding a person's grip on reality as the sword of their consciousness slips from their hands and destroys itself? Or is it just really cool? It is a mystery. Number 13. It's not often you see a video game enemy based on Disney movies, at least not outside games that are Disney branded to begin with, so obviously I had to save this one for last just for novelty value alone. Appearing in the clock tower from Circle of the Moon, these vulpine bowmen are an obvious reference to the hero of Disney's 1973 classic Robin Hood. One version even has a green cloak, so clearly that's where this enemy's coming from. I mean, it's not like anyone ever thought of a bow-wielding fox character before 1973, right? So yeah, if you actually believe what I just said, then you're about as ill-informed as, well, the person who wrote the Castlevania wiki entry for this enemy. In fact, both Disney's Robin Hood and this enemy come from a common literary source: medieval illuminated manuscripts. I'm serious. Middle Ages people loved little pictures of animals doing human things, and humorous drawings like this, known as drolleries, are all over books from the 12th century onwards. Some of the greatest hits of this genre include Dog storms castle defended by rabbits, Knight fights giant snail on tree branch, Rabbit mugs unconscious man with stick, and the all-time classic, Rabbit rides on snail with human head and throws spears at dog standing on other rabbit. It made sense to somebody. These weren't just isolated doodles, though. There was an actual literature that grew up around this concept. One of the most popular and influential animals as people stories from this time was a 12th century collection of stories about a cunning, mischievous character called Reynard the Fox. Reynard predates the first appearance of Robin Hood by about a century, and the two characters have a lot in common. Both are outlaws with lots of enemies who stay ahead of the law through clever tricks and occasional feats of athleticism. Reynard even has his own Sheriff of Nottingham, a greedy and gullible wolf named Isengrim. But obviously the biggest inspiration that Reynard had on Robin Hood was the whole archery thing. You see, Reynard was always portrayed as a brilliant What? What do you mean Reynard isn't an archer? Let me see that book again. Oh. Apparently there's no mention of Reynard ever having a bow in any of the stories featuring him. At all. So yeah, I guess this enemy really is just based on the Disney Robin Hood after all. I feel pretty stupid right now. But you know what's really stupid? Snail Cat. Yep. Snail Cat. What the hell, Middle Ages? I hope you've enjoyed this little trip through some of Castlevania's funniest, freakiest, and folkloriest creatures. But we're not done yet. I mean, this is Castlevania we're talking about. And you know what happens in Castlevania after you deal with a bunch of regular enemies and then take a little breather? That's right. It's a boss fight. So stay tuned for the second half, when we'll crank up the dial and talk about some of the strangest and silliest bosses that the Castlevania series has to offer. See you all then!